Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to have this conversation. With me today is Professor Robert Wright. He is a best-selling author of multiple books, one of the earliest popularizers of evolutionary psychology with his book, The Moral Animal. I forgot to uh, change the settings. It's singular. All right, with The Moral Animal and Why Buddhism is True, and has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Evolution of God. We'll be talking about all of that today, but before we do that, I just want to commend you for having difficult, disagreeable conversations on your podcasts, which I regularly listen to. And what the best example of this is perhaps your conversation with Professor Augustine Fuentes, because I've read his books and I've read yours, so I understand the level of disagreement that you have.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the name. My conversation with who?
Augustine Fuentes.
Oh, yeah. Anthropologist.
Yes, anthropologist. So I understand the level of disagreement that you have with him, but to have such a disagreeable but conversation, but in a polite way without sounding condescending or anything, because I think you were genuinely curious in all three of your conversations, and that is just becoming so rare because we're becoming so tribal.
Mm-hmm. So we are. I agree, and yeah, I try to do a lot of that. And it's not easy because when you disagree with people, it's the more intensely you disagree with them, the easier it is to actually think badly of them as people. And that can degrade the conversation. But he was a very nice guy. It's funny, after my first conversation with him, I went and had coffee with him because he lives in the same town as I do. And it turned out we had gone to high school in the same town in Texas and everything. So we actually had a lot in common. I really liked him as a person, and that always helps. But I agree with you that it's more important now than ever that people make the effort to have civil conversations with people they disagree with.
I think that, the impulse to see the person you disagree with as a bad person is evident to the example of Sam Harris, because after you wrote the article that you did criticizing him for his tribalism, pointing out the fact that he's maybe not as anti-tribal as he thinks of himself, as he took it as a kind of a personal attack. And he thought that you and Reza Aslan and people like them were willingly misrepresenting him. So I think, but I question the efficiency of such a criticism, because it's much easier when you're attacking someone for tribalism to take it as a personal attack. I wouldn't say that this wouldn't be the case when there was disagreement about the existence of God, because there would be a clear agreement about where that disagreement lies. But that's not the case here.
Yeah, the impulse he had, that Sam had, is one I felt myself. I mean, it's kind of, first, it starts with confirmation bias. I mean, somebody writes something critical of your work and you read it looking for flaws, okay, to confirm your bias that your work is great and their criticisms must be wrong. And so you notice the slightest signs of misrepresentation seem big to you. They stand out. You notice them. And then there's the second step of attributing to them the motivation, of consciously misrepresenting you. Sam never really very clearly articulated what he thought how I had misrepresented him. I later wrote about that in my newsletter, the Non-Zero newsletter on Substack, a kind of an elaborate kind of an exegesis of our interaction. And I kind of remain unpersuaded that that I misrepresented him, then again, I would remain unpersuaded, right? I mean, but it's really natural to attribute these malign motivations to people who disagree with you strongly, especially if they attack, your work specifically. And I have to admit that to him, it seemed like I was attacking him personally, because what I did was go through and try to show that, cognitive biases are at work in his own work, which isn't that grave an indictment, because I think cognitive biases are at work in all of our work. It's just that Sam in particular had a tendency, it seemed to me, to position himself as being almost above tribalism, as being almost unique in his capacity for objective analysis. Whereas I think, for all of us, unless you truly have attained enlightenment, in the Eastern sense of the word, and transcended to a perspective that is truly objective, I think all of us struggle with cognitive biases, and including myself. But yeah, you're right. That was kind of the end of our relationship. And Sam had me on his podcast not that much earlier, and I talked about my book. So he may have taken it as kind of, bad form to criticize somebody only months after they've had you on their podcast to talk about your book. That could have gone into it too. But anyway, he blocked me on Twitter. So I guess that's kind of the end of our relationship.
But don't we all pretend like, our perceptions are objective, even though, it's probably motivated by cognitive biases? So, it is, why criticize a person on that specifically? Because it doesn't really help move forward the conversation, perhaps, because I think that this kind of conversation, there will always be a sort of disagreement. There will be no common ground. When you, in contrast, when you talk about tribalism, in particular to groups, say political groups or religious groups, I think that conversation is far more important than this one.
Do you mean what was the value in criticizing Sam in the first place?
In that specific manner, on his personal tribal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just think when anyone is almost positioning themselves as transcending tribalism, it's useful to point out that we all kind of think we transcend tribalism, first of all, right? It's like that's, as you said, I was early on writing about evolutionary psychology in the book you kindly held up. And I argued in that book, which came out in 1994, that, natural selection designed us to think we are being objective when we are in fact not, when we have these biases in favor of self or in favor of group. So when anyone starts talking as if they think they've transcended that, and I think they haven't, I think it's useful to point out that these biases operate so subtly that they're probably wrong. And in Sam's case, I thought I showed he was wrong. But I had a second motivation, which is that I think Sam's whole worldview, or a big chunk of his worldview, is kind of dangerously misguided. This goes back to my original opposition to what was called the New Atheism, right? He came out with this book, The End of Faith, and I took issue with it. Now, unlike most of his critics, I wasn't arguing that the atheism part was wrong. I mean, I'm not myself an atheist. I'm a kind of agnostic with in a certain sense, maybe religious leanings in some sense of the word or other. But anyway, that wasn't my issue with him. My big issue with him was in thinking that kind of the prime mover of violence associated with religious extremism is the religious belief, as opposed to being various other kinds of grievances or material circumstances that happen to manifest themselves in religious form. So Richard Dawkins, for example, one of his fellow new atheists, said, if it weren't for religion, there would be no Israel-Palestine conflict. And I just thought that's an extremely naive and really dangerous way to look at it, because you're never going to understand the root causes of the conflict if you think that, well, if you see a suicide bomber who's Muslim, the problem must be the Islamic belief. No, the source of the conflict is that you have two groups of people who both think they're entitled to live on a certain stretch of land. That's the source of the zero-sum conflict. And in fact, when it started, it didn't have much of a religious dimension on either side. The original Zionists were not particularly religious, and the Arab resistance was not particularly religious. And in fact, there are a lot of Palestinian Christians who are deeply aggrieved. And in fact, the one major act of what you could maybe call Palestinian terrorism on American soil, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in the late 1960s, was done by a Palestinian Christian who said he was doing it over the issue of Israel versus Palestine. But he was a Palestinian Christian, and he was nationalist in his motivation. So I really think, Sam has said we are at war with Islam. I think that is not only, I just think that's a literally dangerous, destructive way to think about it, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You turn it into a religious war if that's what you think it is. So I just want to say, in Sam's case, I had a lot of reasons to want to point to what I considered flaws in his way of viewing the world. And one is that I consider his view of the role of religion in motivating violence to be one that tends to lead to a destructive and counterproductive American foreign policy, if really taken as the guiding light.
I think that criticism is valid, because one of the things that separated the so-called new atheist from the earlier atheist is their insistence on religion being the root of all problem. The earlier atheists were sort of more inclined towards the philosophical, metaphysical side of things, while the new atheists were focusing on sort of the battle between Islam and the West. That is how the narrative is framed in his, Sam Harris's first book, The End of Faith. It aligns with the neoconservative narrative very neatly. So I think that aspect of new atheism, the sociological aspect, the political aspect of it, was one of the reasons for its popularity, and was one of the things that separated it from the rest.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. As I said, my problem isn't with the atheism. It's with the new part, the part that assigns, that assumes. I mean, I'd like to think I could say that there's more than an assumption, but I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's almost an unexamined assumption on the part of people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins that on balance, religion does more harm than good, and is therefore something we need to extinguish before we can all get along. I think we can all get along without extinguishing religion. In fact, I think trying to extinguish it will almost ensure that we don't get along. And I thought Chris Hitchens's book, God is Not Great, whose subtitle was something like Why Religion Poisons Everything, was kind of the perfect example of how ill thought out their beliefs are, because there was nothing approaching a coherent and persuasive argument in that book. I debated Chris Hitchens on it while he was alive, and people can Google it on YouTube if they want to see it.
But I think the optimism that you have about the progress of religion, loosely speaking, which is, as explained in your book, The Evolution of God, is at least partly based on the fact that you think that as religions evolve, they give more importance to, religion can evolve if it gives more importance to values and utility as opposed to the concept of truth. Well, I think for a very large, significant proportion of believers, perhaps most believers would say that they believe in a certain religion because they think that religion is true. They think text, the textual prescriptions are correct. So I think the conception of truth is incompatible with the evolution of religion towards progress in general.
Well, let me kind of spell out the source of my optimism, such as it is. The argument in The Evolution of God drew on the argument I had made in a book called Non-Zero, which was published around the turn of the millennium. And there, the argument there was that, first of all, it's a fact that on balance over time, social organization has grown in complexity and scope. So 10,000 years ago, you have a bunch of hunter-gatherer villages. Over time, you start seeing chiefdoms, political agglomerations of villages that are agriculturally based generally. Then you see cities, you see city-states. You get empires, you get nation states, alliances of nation states, so on. Now we're on the verge of, I like to think we're on the verge of a true global community. There are setbacks happening even as we speak, but the point is that the scale of social organization has tended to grow, and the intricacy of it. And I argued that was largely a result of the development of technologies that facilitated or otherwise encouraged the exploitation of non-zero-sum opportunities. That is, the opportunities for people to play win-win games with other people at greater and greater distances through trade or through other things. Okay, so I first of all, see this tendency for people over historical time to play non-zero-sum games with more and more other people at greater and greater distances from them. So, for example, when I buy a car, I have implicitly paid a tiny increment of the wages of people all over the world, and they have, without even realizing it, collaborated to build me a car. So there's all kinds of non-zero-sum relationships that we may not be aware of, but that are kind of global in scope. Anyway, to get back to The Evolution of God, the argument there was that religion evolves to accommodate non-zero-sum relationships. And in fact, if you ask yourself at any given time, I mean, every religious text, every fundamental religious text of any of the great religions, you can find in it scriptures that encourage belligerence toward other groups, and you can find in it scriptures that encourage the opposite, that encourage understanding and tolerance. And my argument was that if you ask what determines whether at any given time people are going to look in their scripture and try to find the belligerent stuff as opposed to the tolerant stuff, I think it's whether they view the group in question as being in a non-zero-sum relationship with them. If they look at another group and say, hey, we can do business with them, looks like, in fact, we're starting to do business with them and we have a mutually profitable relationship. Now, this could be a commercial relationship. It could be an alliance during wartime with a hostile enemy. But the point is that if you look at when religious groups of all kinds have depicted their scripture as encouraging tolerance, it is, and even in some cases, love and compassion, it is when they see themselves as in a non-zero-sum relationship. So if it is true that over time we see ourselves as in a non-zero-sum relationship with more people at greater remove, it would be my expectation that our conception of religion, even our conception of our God, of what our God wants, would evolve and expand to encourage tolerance toward those people we see as being in a non-zero sum relationship. Now, so that's the only basis for optimism. Now, I should say that in my book Non-Zero, I certainly emphasize that we may fail to cross the threshold to a global community. The whole thing may go down in flames. There are lots of ways it could, but if we manage to, kind of go where history is beckoning us almost, that is to say, to take advantage of the non-zero sum problems and to unite with other countries, which includes, taking advantage of a non-zero sum opportunity includes uniting with other countries and other peoples to solve common problems like climate change and like, arms races that threaten us all, or any other common problem. If we respond wisely, I would say, to the beckoning of history, you can expect religious doctrine to evolve to accommodate that wise response and even encourage it. That's the basic argument. I just wanted to get that out there. That's the sense in which I'm optimistic about progress in religion, and it's a guarded sense. Okay.
Yes, I think this isn't always the case, because I think and I don't know if you agree with this, but I think the transition from polytheism to monolatry to monotheism wasn't necessarily a progressive transition, in the sense that it wasn't necessarily accommodating more or being more inclusive. It was getting more exclusivist, because I think from the earliest emergence of monotheism with Akhenaten to, when monolatry happened, and with Judaism, it was actually becoming more exclusivist, because as opposed to the Babylonians, who had no problems adopting the gods of the people that they were invading, or for that matter, the Romans when they were polytheistic. On the other hand, monotheism has always had a sort of rigidity to itself that I think prevents it from being accommodative and inclusive after a certain level.
I'm not sure. To make sure people understand what you're talking about, you mentioned monolatry, which is it isn't the denial of the existence of other gods. It's just the insistence that your people worship only one God. And in my book, I depict, as other people had depicted, Israelite religion as passing through a phase from polytheism to monolatry to true monotheism. And it's certainly true that that monotheism is not inherently tolerant. And in fact, I argue that in the during the exile, it seems to be the case that the part of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, which itself seems to have been written by more than one author at more than one time, but the part of it that may be the Bible's, the earliest in time recording of true monotheism, it seems to be found in a part of Isaiah that they think was written during the exile, after the trauma of exile. And it's very vengeful. It's not tolerant. It's like, yeah, we worship the one true God, and he's going to get payback. You're going to be sorry you messed with us. But as I note, there are books that seem to be written later, after, it seems to be the case that when the Israelites are returned to Israel, they are at that point part of a multinational empire, and getting along with their neighbors is, first of all, being encouraged by the head of the empire, the Persians, And secondly, it's in their interest. Their neighbors are not threats now. They're part of the same empire. They can trade with them and stuff. And I argue that at that point, in for example, the Book of Ruth, where a deep connection is asserted with the Moabites, who earlier had been depicted as mortal enemies. That you see that at a time when the Israelites do see themselves in a non-zero sum relationship with their neighbors, you see very tolerant verses emerging. So, which by the way means that I do not argue in that book that the tolerant version of God has to await the birth of Christianity. I do think there's a lot of tolerance shown in parts of the evolution of Christianity for reasons that that I argue are the reasons, but in any event, I'm not arguing that monotheism is inherently certainly tolerant, but I don't see it as being inherently intolerant. I mean, I take your point that polytheism has a particular kind of capacity for tolerance, which is kind of, we worship our God, you worship yours. On the other hand, as you know, that's not the way polytheism always plays out, right? There are we can point to intolerant manifestations. So anyway, that's my view on
do you think as religions become more expansive, perhaps they would be better placed if they would be better able to avoid conflicts if they were polytheistic rather than monotheist?
I'm sorry. A noise. I heard a noise from my computer at the same time you're asking the question. You're asking if can you just repeat the question?
Yes, as religion become more expansive, as they expand to other countries and meet with different people, do you think that perhaps polytheism will better serve and as more accommodative than monotheism?
It's a good question. I tend to think not. I mean, it's a question I haven't really thoroughly examined as to whether one has an advantage over the other. I certainly believe there are examples of both being accommodating to non-zero sum dynamics, and of both illustrating that when there is a perception of zero sumness of a conflict of interest, especially if there's like a mortal conflict of interest, then tolerance is not what you will see emerging from either of them. I feel those things strongly, but whether one has an edge over the other in its capacity to accommodate non-zero sum dynamics, I don't really have a view on.
Right. Well, I noticed in your book there is a lack of focus on Eastern religions because you almost never talk about it, and I'm wondering why.
You mean in the evolution of God?
Yes. Because I think that in many instances of Western religion, the same sort of arguments can be made, concerning Rig Veda and other texts.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I should say my most recent book is called Why Buddhism is True. So I haven't entirely ignored Eastern religion, but the evolution of God, it was about the emergence of the Abrahamic God. There's no doubt. I mean, that's what the book is about. That was just my subject. And remember, it was written at a time when a time that sadly is not entirely past, when there was a certain amount of conflict that was seen as being between the Abrahamic religions, right? Between Christianity and Islam, between Islam and Judaism, and so on. So I wanted to go through and, for one thing, show that in all three of those cases, with all three of those Abrahamic religions, you have had tolerant manifestations and belligerent manifestations. It all depends on the circumstances. So I wanted to tell a story that was relevant to what, in America at least, was a preoccupation at the time, war on terrorism. And again, this was partly a response to the new atheists. Okay, they have a very different view of the causal place of religion in world affairs. They view it as being much more of a prime mover and less of something that is responding to material facts on the ground. So that's the reason I focused on the Abrahamic God. But it's just a book about the Abrahamic God. That's why it doesn't get into Eastern religion very much. It does get into polytheism because Abrahamic religion emerged from polytheism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you also talk a bit about whether the idea of God is a byproduct or an adaptation. And well, interestingly, you take the case that it is actually a byproduct. So why do you think that's the case?
Okay, so this is a question about kind of what in human nature predisposes us toward religious belief. And there are kind of two views among people who even view the question in Darwinian terms, in terms of any kind of evolutionary psychology. And one view is a kind of what you could call a group selectionist view, which is that a strong propensity to believe in religion per se, in gods and so on, evolved because it was conducive to group fitness. Kind of, it's a bonding thing within
David
the group.
Sloan Wilson. That's the view of David Sloan Wilson.
That's right. Although they're sometimes David Sloan Wilson is sometimes a little vague for my money on whether he's talking about biological evolution or cultural evolution. There's no doubt. Well, first of all, there's no doubt that group selection, that is to say, the evolution of traits for the quote good of the group, it can happen in biological evolution. It has happened. The question is how often in human evolution there's been really an opportunity for it to happen. There's also no doubt it can happen in cultural evolution. I mean, obviously, whole cultural belief systems evolve that have the function of helping the group cohere. For my money, David is a little vague sometimes on whether he's talking about biological or cultural evolution when he's talking about group selection, but he definitely sees religion as adaptive at the group level. And I agree. It's just that I think it's mainly for reasons of cultural evolution that it's adaptive at the group level when it is. Anyway, so the alternative view as to why there might be, in any sense, a genetic leaning toward religious belief is the one you mentioned, where in this view, there's not so much group selection going on, and religion is more of a byproduct of a lot of little mental and emotional tendencies that evolved more in a kind of what would be called an individual selectionist way. So these include things like, for example, it's I forget the term, hyperactive agent.
HADD, hyperactive detection device. Yeah.
Agent detection or something.
Something.
And that's the idea, I guess, that if you're, if 100,000 years ago, your ancestors are walking through the woods and they hear a stirring, they're better off assuming it's a hostile animal. Because if they just assume it's the wind and it's a hostile animal, they're dead. So there's a tendency to project agency onto natural processes that don't have agency. This is the argument, at least. And so this would be, and you can see how that could lead to, a storm happens, a god must have done it, right? If a storm happens, right? So the argument is there are a lot of little tendencies that together make us amenable to religious explanations of things, religious beliefs, even rituals. So those are the two arguments in the kind of appendix of my book, The Evolution of God, where I got into these issues. I did tend to side, as you said, with the byproduct view. I'm not a big anti-group selectionist, but I'm more inclined to individual selectionist explanations.
Also, I think that the fact that we see intentions when there is no intentions, we tend to anthropomorphize things, that probably led us to create God in our own image. And, because God has all the attributes that human beings has, even though may not always look like us, maybe
Right.
formless, but it feels God is depicted as feeling jealous and angry and loving. Right. So all of these are human attributes. So
Right.
I think that supports the byproduct case.
Right. One of the main things religion does from early time, I mean, from, religion in, from, to the extent that we can tell what it was doing from early times, that is to say pre-urban and everything, is it was part of the process by which people tried to figure out why bad things happen and then do things that will make them not happen so much. And this, what you described, is all part of this reckoning. Like, oh, a storm wipes out our houses. Why did that happen? And what can we do to make it not happen? And, a lot of what we now recognize as false beliefs arose. It was because, we didn't do some ritual the day before or something. Sometimes, kind of correct answers would evolve, I mean, if there's a sexually transmitted disease and you think it's God's punishment for having sex rather than that it's germs being transmitted through the sex, right? Well, that will work, as an explanation in the sense of leading you to not do the things that do contribute to the disease. And sometimes religion does lead to those kinds of things, but you're right that, I mean, the anthropomorphizing natural processes or anthropomorphizing what you believe is behind those processes is a huge part of religion, and it aids in this fundamental quest of religion, which has over time become more what the scientific and technical quest is about, figuring out why bad things happen and preventing them.
Right. So, well, I understand that we're running out of time, but I want to quickly get through evolutionary psychology because my view on it is not the same as yours. It's more of the view that Massimo Pigliocci holds. So I see it as a kind of quasi-science, helpful, of course, but I want to talk about, because I wrote a critique of it and I mentioned your work, and I want to get to it to hear your explanation so as to understand that I'm not misrepresenting you or anything. So I think that a lot of feminists, let's say, talk about the conflict that evolutionary psychology has with feminism, and the response is usually that this is disinterested science. But reading your book, The Moral Animal, I don't get the sense that it's actually disinterested, because you write about the kind of society that would be consistent with the principles of evolutionary psychology, and according to you it will be Victorian England, where and if that impulse of evolutionary psychology ignored, the consequences will be, in your words, fatherless children, embittered women, complaints about date rape and sexual harassment. It seems harder these days, you write, to declare the Victorian war against male lust pitiable. So while you do mention that you're not, making a prescriptive case, it seems from the consequences that you mentioned that, well, we would all be better off in that sort of society.
Well, no, I'm not advocating a return to Victorian morality. And first of all, I would say you're right that there's a part of the book where I, toward the end, where I try to take, I say, well, if the basic story of evolutionary psychology about human nature is right, what does this tell us about what kinds of social structures are and are not feasible, or what kinds of social structures will carry certain costs and so on. And, if you want people to be reasonably happy, or if you decide you would you think children benefit more from two-parent households, how do you preserve that? And one thing I said about Victorian morality is one thing it did that I think in light of evolutionary psychology, you realize is not that easy, is that it preserved monogamous marriage in a context of significant income and status inequality. Okay. Now, I'm not saying income and status inequality is a good thing. One way to, but I think one thing you do realize when you go through both the annals of human, history and sexuality and different approaches to kind of regulating sexuality in different societies is you realize that one thing that very often happens in when there's tremendous social inequality historically has been polygamy, where a small number of powerful men have many wives, and a number of low status men don't have wives. Those societies are often authoritarian, apparently because those wifeless men, mateless men, cause trouble. And so the powerful men, to preserve their monopoly on sexual resources, repress those men. Okay. That's something you see. That also is not something I'm endorsing. I'm not endorsing, strictly speaking, any of these things. I'm just saying, evolutionary psychology helps you understand why some of these patterns happen and why there may be some hard choices. Now, one solution that I think would be fine, if you agree that it's a problem. I mean, you always have problems along these lines when you have high inequality, income and social inequality. Okay, so for example, in Victorian England, one way monogamous marriage was preserved was there was a lot of prostitution. Okay, so men, rather than having multiple wives, some of the men, not all, of the kind of rich men, in an age when serial monogamy was not really an option because divorce was so heavily stigmatized, there was prostitution. So there's something in all these arrangements, that in any society you can point to something that's unfortunate, right? And I'm mainly saying there may be these trade-offs. And one solution that has a lot of appeal, if you do, and again, at the time I was writing, the literature seemed to suggest that in America, kids were better off with two-parent households. Maybe that's no longer the case. Maybe it wasn't even the case then, and the data was off. But I'm just saying, if you do want to do that, if you want to have a lot of kids reared in two-parent households, you may have to reckon with some tough trade-offs. But one solution would be to increase income equality, which I argued. Yeah. That's a good thing. I'm in favor of that. I wish taxes in America were much more progressive than they are and did much more to equalize people along economic lines. And that would indeed, that's a way to get around this whole trade-off of that seems to, well, it's a way to get around some of the downsides, the various kinds of downsides you seem to inevitably see when you have high income inequality. That's one way around them. Now, maybe that there are downsides to trying to bring income equality. I'm just pointing out that there are trade-offs. And I don't doubt that if I went back and reread that stuff, I would myself be shocked by how morally conservative I sounded. That can happen when, 30 years go by after you write something, because times change. Still, strictly speaking, I do think what I was doing, even at the time, was trying to emphasize that human nature may present us with trade-offs that are uncomfortable, but we may have to deal with them.
Well, I think there are some aspects, you write about Darwinian self-help in The Moral Animal, where you mention that a proliferation of low-cut dresses, as it were, will lessen men's commitment. So if you want a committed relationship, you shouldn't wear low-cut dresses. So and this principle, you write, is firmly rooted in the men's mind. So is that something that you continue to agree with?
I'd have to see the exact passage. I didn't hear exactly what you said. Are you saying?
You wrote that a proliferation of low-cut dresses will lead to a decrease in men's commitment as well as respect for women. So in your words, if you want to hear vows of eternal devotions right up to your wedding day.
I don't think I wrote that exact sentence. What I may have been is saying that, men do, a misconception that's about evolutionary psychology is that it's saying that women want a marriage for life and men just want short-term sexual opportunities. That's not the idea at all. It is both natural for women to cheat on a partner and natural for men to do that and so on. The question is, under what circumstances are these things more likely to happen for the two sexes? Okay. And those, I think, are very different. There are asymmetries in that sense. And on the male side, you seem to have in male psychology, this is, heterosexual male psychology, and it seems fairly deeply embedded for reasons that, for theoretical reasons that seem plausible, and there's some evidence that it's fairly deeply embedded. A tendency to distinguish between the kinds of a kind of woman you want to, as a biologist would put it, or an evolutionary psychologist might put it, invest in. That is to say, not just have sex with them, stick around, help rear the kids, and the kinds of women that you would be happy to have sex with, but do not feel like investing in. Okay. Again, this is, I wish it were otherwise. Life would be much simpler if male psychology did not seem to be distinctive in this way. And, but I think it is. And I think, and that's not to say women don't have a version of this. It's just that the version would be different. We don't have time to get into it deeply. But so the point was, if you ask, well, what kinds of things would men like in a lifetime mate? They would like, in principle, just in strict Darwinian theory, they would like to see cues that the woman is going to be faithful to them. Because on the male side, it is in Darwinian terms kind of a disaster to spend your whole life raising kids who aren't yours. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean you think about this, that we're designed to think, oh, if she's unfaithful to me, I will waste my life rearing kids that aren't mine, and I won't get any genes in the next generation. That's not the way natural selection works. The logic of natural selection isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily play out at a conscious level. But the logic of evolutionary psychology does suggest that that men may, if you ask what cues make them inclined to invest in a woman, one would be that they're going to be faithful. Okay, and this is it's kind of an incendiary thing to say, because people say, well, are you saying that a woman might say, well, are you saying that if I fool around with a bunch of men, just as men are allowed to do with women, and we don't think that necessarily increases their perceived value as a mate, that will reduced my perceived value as a mate in the eyes of some man? The answer is that's a possibility. I'm not, I'm just trying to tell you what the theory and evidence seems to point to. I would also emphasize, though, that this stuff is all tentative. And, what's the name of the guy who wrote The Mating Mind?
Geoffrey Miller.
Right. Have you talked to him?
I will.
He would be a fascinating case because he is, on the one hand, a Darwinian who understands the Darwinian theory. But on the other hand, he's in this polyamory community, right? Yeah. So he would seem to be living defiance of this idea, because I believe he is now actually married a woman who was also
Diana Fissman.
Right. Who's been on, both of them have been on my show, on my podcast, The Wright Show. And so ask him, what the, because it's not, I suspect what he'll say is, well, I don't know what he'll say. We've talked about it a little, but it's an interesting question. I mean, but because, we really don't, even if you accept that, okay, males are naturally inclined to look in women they're going to invest in for cues of commitment to them, that doesn't tell you what the cues would be. And it may well be that given the amount of promiscuity there likely was in the environment of evolution, right, that men can deal with a certain amount of a history of promiscuity on the part of the mate, and the things that they that there are cues they can see of commitment to them personally going forward that overcome that history. That's certainly possible. But what I think is not at all likely is that this whole discussion has no relationship to the reality of sexual relations between heterosexual men and women. And I think, I frankly think the claim that they don't, that we are in this respect blank slates and there are no differences between male and female romantic and sexual psychology, I personally think that is very often used to exploit women. And I don't, I think it's very often used by men who are, well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not in touch enough with what's going on these days, but I know in my day it was used to exploit women in ways that led them disappointed and feeling that they had been misled about the nature of a relationship that led to sex. And so I don't, I understand the idea, because a lot of parts of evolutionary psychology do sound like they could be designed to justify, patriarchy or male or various kinds of male dominance or exploitation of women. But I would say I think a whole lot of those those fears disappear if you just, first of all, realize we're not saying that what's natural is what's good. Yeah. If there's anything evolutionary psychology teaches us, it's that what's natural is not at all necessarily what's good. And in fact, most of my current crusade, which is about the psychology that divides people into bitterly inimical groups, is about how unfortunate natural human psychological endowments are. And, and I would also say that my last book, Why Buddhism is True, it focuses on ways that even, very kinds of subtle and powerful influences on our behavior can be overcome. And Geoffrey Miller, I know this is one thing we talked about. I think this is one reason he became interested in meditation, is because he became aware, I think, he probably already knew this, but in the polyamorous community, jealousy is a very strong force. And it's a little different in men and women, the way it plays out, but it's a strong force in both. And you can imagine it causing real trouble amid polyamory, right? And I think he believes that that meditation is one way you can grapple with that. But I want to emphasize that there's in principle no limit to the extent to which we can, in effect, alter human nature. It's just that it's not easy, and I don't think it helps us to not acknowledge the challenges it poses us with.
Yes, but I agree with the idea that the blank slate is a dangerous idea. I don't think that most scientists today would subscribe to it, and I recognize your concerns, but I do also think that at the movement where these criticisms were made, they were kind of understandable, given that a lot of the material that was coming out then, like Thornhill and Palmer spoke, they were explicitly sort of making social prescriptions and things like that. So in that context, it's sort of understandable. So, but well, I'm going to ask you. This is going to be the last question as we run out of time.
Well, I have about 5 more minutes if you want to bring up one more subject. 5 or 10 more minutes.
All right. So I want to ask you if you think evolutionary psychology would do well if it perhaps expanded its paradigm, because I think that the paradigm of evolutionary psychology is kind of restrictive, rigid, which is perhaps why people like Jaak Panksepp, whose work was basically, doing what evolutionary psychology aimed to do, but he never described himself as an evolutionary psychologist. In fact, critiqued the field openly because of the paradigm that it had. Or for that matter, most recently, the example would be Cecilia Hayes, who is promoting a sort of cultural evolutionary psychology. So I think the framework of evolutionary psychology is the paradigm of evolutionary psychology is perhaps a bit too rigid, a bit too restricted, and expanding it would perhaps bring in more interdisciplinary researchers into the field.
Well, I'm not familiar with those works, so I just would have to be to really respond to that question, because there's certainly a lot of people who say, yeah, I'm into evolutionary psychology and here's this view, and it's really, it's not a view that belongs within the paradigm of evolutionary psychology. I mean, I've certainly seen that, and at the other kind of, a related problem for evolutionary psychology is kind of very casual evolutionary psychology. Okay, so, for example, when you talk about like the vocational patterns between men and women, this became a big issue in the Google James Damore thing. Yeah. And there was a lot of, there are differences in aptitude and interest, at least if you measure aptitude by standardized tests, difference in which areas men versus women tend to be a little stronger in and maybe tend to be interested in. And I think there was a tendency amid that controversy for some people to casually assert that these differences had a genetic basis. And look, they certainly could, but I want to emphasize that the theoretical reasons for believing that they do have a genetic basis are not nearly as strong as the theoretical basis for believing that certain differences in sexual psychology do. Okay. So for example, differences in male and female sexual psychology. Given the fact that for a long time, our species has had, has allowed women to have a child at most once a year, and really less often than that because nursing has suppressed ovulation. And given the fact that men in principle can, given the fundamental asymmetries in the biology of reproduction and the way, men do participate in the rearing of some of the children and so on, it would be, for you to believe that there are going to be no differences in the nature of jealousy, you would almost have to not believe in natural selection. I mean, that's how strong I think the theoretical reasons are. But when you move into these things about how, like, well, boys like trucks and girls like dolls, it's possible that that has a genetic basis. I'm obviously open to these kinds of explanations, but I want to emphasize that the theoretical reasons for believing that are, in my view, not as strong, especially since trucks per se didn't exist, in our evolutionary environment. And so that's a problem too for evolutionary psychology. It's kind of casual evolutionary psychology. And what bothers me is almost all evolutionary psychologists get accused of doing casual evolutionary psychology, but not all are. And in my book, The Moral Animal, one thing I tried to do is point out that a lot of the arguments are actually weak. Okay. There are we have differing degrees of confidence in different theories about human nature. And I think there are evolutionary psychologists who try to qualify their work appropriately, and separate the weak but interesting conjecture from the stronger theories. But it's a problem that evolutionary psychology seems like a game anyone can play, I guess I would say.
But it does have a strong impulse to sort of create informed conjectures, as it were, which are perhaps not as well researched. I see it a lot even in the works of people I admire, people like Steven Pinker, in How the Mind Works. There are a lot of instances where he would, make a what if scenario. And I think that when we're talking about issues which are as influential or as contentious as this, it's better to be perhaps a bit more careful, because otherwise, the stereotype becomes the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to see the particular what if scenarios he's throwing out. I would say that in most sciences, throwing out wild conjectures is part of the scientific process, right? And sometimes it leads to big blind alleys. It's looking like string theory is probably bullshit. Billions of, well, at least hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent supporting it. I'm not sure it's bullshit, but it hasn't led anywhere. So, I mean, and it's not a bad thing. I mean that wild conjectures are entertained. Maybe they shouldn't be so heavily subsidized before they generate a testable prediction. But leaving that aside, in most fields, conjecture is just considered part of the process by which a serious theory takes form. In evolutionary psychology, if you do exactly what's done in physics and chemistry and everywhere else and go, well, wait, maybe this could be it, right? Does this make sense? People get upset. And look, I understand why, because we're dealing with human beings, and these ideas would have implications for, like, in some cases for, well, then what policy does make sense? What policy is likely to be effective to alleviate poverty or something, if this is true? So they have real stakes. I get that. I just want to say that, it's a natural part of inquiry to come up with to start off with wild conjecture. And to me, the main thing is that you always qualify it appropriately. And I think that's not done often enough. I tried very hard to do that in The Moral Animal. Maybe I failed, but I understand why it's a more explosive issue in human psychology than in physics.
What do you think about the future of evolutionary psychology as a field? And related question, what do you think about Pigliocci's argument? I'm not sure if you've read Nonsense and Stills, where Professor Pigliocci essentially argues that evolutionary psychology is a quasi-science. So I want to know.
This is Massimo. This is Massimo Pugliese?
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine. When did the book come out, though? I haven't.
This is in 2010. This is
yeah.
Very...
So I haven't read the book. I should have him on for a good evolutionary psychology argument. I'm not that familiar. I mean, I'm familiar with I'd have to hear what his specific argument is, or, it's an unusual. You got to understand. I mean, evolution is a very challenging field. Period. Establishing that anything is a biological adaptation is very hard. You can't just run some experiment and control the variables. Evolution is in the past. We're just left with its products. There's no way of knowing for sure with any adaptation. There's no way of knowing for sure that polar bears are white because that helps them blend in with the snow. We assume it is. Nobody gets upset just because it's, not an entirely tested theory. But it's just inherently hard. And for that reason, you often wind up bringing to bear an unusual array of evidence. So, for example, in the case of male and female sexual psychology, you wind up doing things ranging from cross-cultural data, like does jealousy tend to differ between men and women according to, say, surveys in a bunch of different cultures? If it doesn't, if it's only one culture, then it looks bad for your hypothesis. Ranging from that kind of thing to things like the relative size of testes in different primate species. It may seem weird, correlating things like that with mating patterns in different primate species. That also is relevant. That also can be relevant. And it's an unusual inquiry where a theory only starts earning confidence when it's consistent with evidence of kind of wildly varying kinds, right? But I think we are forced into that situation by the kind of epistemological challenges posed, first of all, by evolutionary biology generally, just figuring out what is an adaptation. And then secondly, the further complications posed by human psychology, which are massive, owing to the influence of culture and upbringing and everything. So it's just a very hard problem. And honestly, I don't know how much progress there's going to be because it is a huge challenge. Where I wish there would be more progress is in the realm of human, in the realm of human moral psychology, and other things that feed into kind of conflict between groups and between people, and that that lead to wars. I think not enough has really been done in that area, but it's hard.
As in to inhibit tribalism.
What's that? Yeah. I mean,
inhibiting tribalism.
I'm speaking broadly about what you call the psychology of tribalism. I understand why some people find the word tribalism offensive, but it isn't meant that way.
Well, I think most of us are tribals, so.
Right. That's the point. Is that this doesn't depend on a stereotype that only tribes in the classic anthropological sense are hostile and fight. No, we all do it. It just so happens that the term tribal has become the term, but it is evidence of the universality of the basics of human nature, that the same things show up in these different contexts. It's like it can be two urban gangs, it can be two countries at war, it can be two traditional tribes fighting, it can be a fight within a family, it can be a fight between families. It's the same basic psychology everywhere. We are all, and this is, at least my version of evolutionary psychology is a big theme, is just the universality of human nature. Yes, there are genetic differences among people, but at a fundamental level, we all have the same challenges, and we're working out the same puzzle.
Yes, I think that's a great note to end. It was an honor talking with you, Professor Wright. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot from you. You've been one of my intellectual heroes. You're the sort of writer I aspire to be. So,
Well, I really appreciate the questions were very good. I appreciate that that compliment. I should say I'm a professor in a limited sense. I have taught at a few colleges that I taught a Buddhism seminar at Princeton and a seminar on the biology of moral intuition, actually, and I've taught at Penn and so on. But I'm not a credentialed anything. I'm not a PhD in anything. I just started as a journalist and wound up writing about these things in in kind of a quasi-academic way. I mean, in the sense that there are footnotes and I try to explore subjects deeply, but I don't have a PhD in psychology or biology or anything else. So maybe that's even more reason to be skeptical of me.
Well, I would highly recommend viewers to check out your books and your YouTube channel, which I will link in the description box below. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.